Hey there, I'm Sarah A. Chrisman, the author of The Tales of Chetzemoka, and there's a famous quote by 18th century writer Samuel Johnson who said that the greater part of a writer's time is spent reading in order to write, and a man will turn over half a library in order to make one book. Now, in a short video like this one, I can't show you half my library, so I can't share all the books that go into one of my Tales of Chetzemoka, but I did want to share just a few of the most important ones that have helped me build the world in my stories, and that also help my readers travel there with me. Anyone who's read the endnotes in my Tales of Chetzemoka novels has seen the lists of the various specific books where I got particular pieces of information or from which I cribbed historic quotes for that particular book. On a larger scale, I would say that every book I've ever read has contributed in some way to the ones I write, because human beings are a composite of knowledge and experience, and every book we read contributes to our understanding of the world. In a video I did on research tips back in December of 2019, I already explained how in the back of each notebook that I use to write my Chetzemoka stories, I've essentially got a commonplace book of notes that I already put together for that particular story before I ever started writing it. And these notes I get from anything from 19th century novels to nonfiction books to a lot of the notes come from magazines and newspaper articles from the 19th century. But today I want to talk about the work of three particular authors who've had a really big influence on me and the world of Chetzemoka. And those are Louisa May Alcott, Jean Stratton Porter, and Ellen Montgomery. There are a lot of really wonderful books in the world, but for me personally, the ones that I think tend to mean the most to me and really get the deepest into my heart are the ones that I enjoyed as a child, but that I see something new in every single time I read them. These are books that, as I've grown up, the more I read them, the more deeply they seem to call to me, and the more I understand them and the more I see in them, the older I get. And they never get old. That's what I love about them. It's something that I aspire to in my own writings, but I must bow to the masters. As a child, I loved Little Women, and I had a great deal of sympathy with Jo's early attempts at authorship. I thought she was a terrible fool for turning down Laurie, but the older I get, the more I understand it. Jo had such a forceful personality, she and Laurie would have inevitably found themselves at loggerheads, just as Marmee said they would. Also, in her own way, Jo was even more ambitious than Amy was. Whereas Amy longed for worldly comforts and worldly goods, Jo's ambition was an intellectual sort, so she really needed a husband who she could look up to intellectually, and who could challenge her in ways that Laurie just couldn't. I was about 7 years old the first time I read Little Women. The story's the same after all these years, but my understanding of that story has grown up with me. Jean Stratton Porter isn't quite as ubiquitous a household name as the other two authors I'm discussing today, but in my opinion she deserves to be. She describes the little everyday details of life even more vividly than Alcott does, and there's a real beauty to the way her characters work to overcome their circumstances. In her book Laddie, she manages to create a character who's both a fairy tale princess and a real flesh-and-blood woman, and the audience is privileged to see her romance through the eyes of her beau's little sister, a keen little observer with the pragmatism of a farm girl who nonetheless sees life through a veil of romance. The most commonly discussed aspect of Stratton Porter's work is her ability as an author to capture a sense of place, the Limberlost wilderness that was so dear to her, and where she tamed wild birds and collected butterflies. Her works transport her readers to the Indiana wilderness where willows and scrub oaks grow amidst more valuable timber along with profusions of wildflowers. Stratton Porter describes the Limberlost so vividly, reading one of her books is like a vacation through time and space. It's a marvelous experience, and in my own books I try very hard to bring the Pacific Northwest alive for people, in the same way that Stratton Porter brings old Indiana to life. I always want the readers of the Tales of Chetzemoka to smell the spicy cedars of the woods here, and feel the salt spray of the ocean, just like Stratton Porter's readers feel the soft moss and hear the bird songs that she loved. What Jean Stratton Porter did for the Limberlost, L.M. Montgomery did for Prince Edward Island, and in the process she gave the world a spunky heroine we've all been in love with ever since, Anne Shirley, everyone's favorite redhead. Oh, what I mean to say is second favorite redhead. Oh, sorry, Mom. Actually, what I really meant is, oh, and sorry, Grandma. So I guess what I really meant, oh, and sorry, great-grandma, and sorry, great-grandpa. Can I just say I like Anne Shirley an awful lot, no matter who my favorite redhead is? I just like her. I think everyone does. There's just something so very real and eminently relatable about Anne's mishaps that always start with the best of intentions but end in disaster. But the most wonderful thing about Anne is her boundless optimism, no matter what life throws at her. She seems to be the very embodiment of one of my favorite Victorian quotes. Refuse to dwell among shadows when there is so much sunshine in the world. Books should remind us to see the sunshine in the world, not the shadows, and as Anne might put it, to see the boundless scope for imagination in the world. Anne's town of Avonlea is very real to anyone who's read Montgomery's works, but you wouldn't have found it on a map in her time. The real town is actually named Cavendish. Montgomery renamed it for her stories, but she kept the real homes and settings within the town, just like I did with Port Townsend and Chetzemoka. These books have a lot of important themes in common, from optimism and love to the importance of hard work to the beauty of femininity. And they all keep certain times alive for people. And in the case of Jean Stratton Porter's works and the Anne books, they bring places to life as well. Now, Little Women is very solidly dated. It starts when the girl's father is a chaplain, a military chaplain, in the American Civil War. That's a very solid historical event that dates it to the mid-1860s. And then it goes into the 1870s as the girls grow up. But very solidly dated. It's the most solidly dated. The only one of the Anne books that is quite that specific is the very last one, Rilla of Ingleside. And that's actually more about Anne's daughter. And in this one, her children are dealing with, Anne's children are dealing with World War I. So that's another very solid historical date. But otherwise, most of the Anne books tend to exist, they sort of hover around the turn of the 20th century. And there's a very timeless feel to them because Ellen Montgomery was doing that very deliberately. She was being a little vague about some of the technologies, even though Gilbert becomes a doctor, so he would have been dealing with lots of technology. That part is slightly glossed over to give it more of a timeless feel, so that the books can do that sort of magical hovering around the turn of the 20th century. And Jean Stratton Porter's works also, she tries for a timeless feel. If you read really close, the fashions are quite Edwardian. Jean Stratton Porter in these books is really big on the white dresses that were so fashionable in the Edwardian era. So we've gone from the 1860s to right around the turn of the 20th century to early 20th century. 1860s, 20th century, early 20th century. That's a big gap. And it's a gap that I felt needed to be filled. The 1880s and 90s were a really dynamic time when a lot of important things were going on that shaped our modern world. When I set out to write the Tales of Chetzemoka, I thought it was high time someone threw a spotlight on that chapter of history and helped people understand it better. Besides seeing a gap that needed to be filled in terms of time, I also saw that there was a gap waiting to be filled in terms of place. There are plenty of books set in the Old West, but most of the time they tend to take place in the dusty deserts of the Southwest, or they're on the prairie somewhere like Laura Ingalls' Little House books were. Now, you'll get an occasional foray into California, and if an author's really going wild, you might get up to Montana or the Alaskan Gold Rush. But the Pacific Northwest, with its towering moss-covered forests and snow-covered volcanoes, gets left out of the narrative. Oregon Trail stories tend to end at the Columbia River with a vague impression that that was the end of things. But that wasn't the end of things, not by a long shot. And I wanted to show off how much more there is to explore of the wonderful history of the Pacific Northwest and its people. That's what the Tales of Chetzemoka are all about. Thank you for watching today. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please give it a nice thumbs up, and remember to tell your friends about my books. Happy reading!